The following is a conversation with Julian Robinson. Julian Robinson is the Shadow Minister for Finance and a member of the Jamaican Parliament. Before entering representational politics, Julian began his career as a management consultant in London, working for international firms like IBM, where he was responsible for developing and implementing digital business strategies. I think that one of the pillars for economic growth in the Caribbean is a solid digital infrastructure and digital literacy programs that ensure that future generations are equipped with the necessary skills to compete in a global economy. In my opinion, the only way to get to that goal is through the collaboration of the public and private sector and a regulatory framework that enables healthy competition and the free flow of money, goods, and ideas. This is the Simon Küpper podcast, and this is my conversation with Julian Robinson. Why did you switch from the corporate career or background into politics? Was there a specific reason?
I always had an interest. I always had a passion for service. I got involved in student government while I was at the university. And I always felt that this was my calling to be involved in serving others. And so, even when I was away working, I knew I wanted to come back home, and I did. And, I was always drawn to this type of activity. At some point you recognize what you have a passion for and you want to pursue that passion. And that's really why I'm doing what I'm doing,
Yeah, that's true. So, and I think a lot of your work in the past, and I think also today, touches technology or digital transformation. So before we dive into that, how would you explain or maybe define digital transformation? Because I think it's a kind of maybe overused buzzword, I don't know,
Sure.
But people use it very loosely. So how would you explain it?
Yes, I think it is overused, and I think particularly coming out of the pandemic, it's a term that everybody now positions as where we need to go, because you're moving from doing things physically. The pandemic has forced people to move online, and so in a sense, businesses, individuals have had to adapt. For me, it is about how do you, as a business, how do you ensure that your processes are moved online so that you can continue to do the same things that you did in the physical world without having a physical world. So it does mean ensuring that your business processes can be adapted online, your logistics, particularly if you're involved in the delivery of physical goods or services, that those things can be done online. And what we've seen in Jamaica is that people have been forced to, I would say prior to a year ago, March last year, I probably just fleetingly heard about Zoom, right? but now we have multiple Zoom calls every day. My 6-year-old son has been in online school for a year, online using Zoom.
True.
Banks have had to push more of their processes online because of the restrictions of physical gathering. So too other businesses. Delivery businesses have sprung up because persons can't eat out in the way that they used to do. So I think what it is, it's how do businesses adapt to this environment by building processes that allow people to continue to consume their goods or services online. For me, I think the big challenge in Jamaica is really the digital divide. There are persons who, like I would say myself, the adjustment hasn't been huge for me because I was always online. I do most of my financial transactions online. I rarely go into a branch unless I'm forced to do so. So the adjustment wasn't hard for me. And I think the younger generation who are more easily adapted to the embracing the technology, it wasn't a big deal. But then you have a larger cross-section of people who are not used to doing things online. If I use my father as an example, he does nothing online. He doesn't do banking or any of these things online because he's just from a generation that never got into it. So the question is, how do you bring those persons along with you. And what we're seeing is government has been forced, in particular in delivering assistance to the most needy, to do it electronically. But it has meant that a lot of those who are in need, who can't, don't have a computer, a laptop to log on, to put in their details to access services, some of them are getting left behind. I mean, just yesterday in Parliament, the minister announced an incentive for persons who are fully vaccinated. They're going to get 10,000 Jamaican dollars to try and incentivize more people to be, anybody over 60, sorry, over 60, which, because the over 60s are the most vulnerable part of your population. But equally, those are the persons who are least likely to be able to go online, complete an application form, receive the funds. So for me, what I consider to be the big challenge is that you're going to have a set of people who are going to be left behind. And somehow both between the public and the private sector, we have to find a way to bridge that gap. So for persons who don't have access readily, meaning they don't have, internet connectivity unlimited, they have to be purchasing it on a daily basis. How do you ensure that those persons can continue to consume, government services and other things online, particularly for people from a poorer background who simply don't have either devices or access? How do you ensure that they can continue to have access? So for me, I think it has presented an opportunity, and people have, a cross-section of persons have fully adapted, but there are many more who I believe are being left behind.
Yeah, I think you touched, or my question would be, what do you see the areas that have been affected the most over the last, let's say, 12 months? Because I think one area, or the two you already mentioned, it's education and finance and banking and payments and everything around that. As same as the infrastructure itself, because as you said, if people don't have, let's say, just an internet connection in some rural areas of the Caribbean in general, or maybe in Jamaica specifically. So where do you see the main bottlenecks that maybe prevent that people get access there right now? And or maybe are there other areas where you see there needs to be change?
I think the big one is governments have to ensure that they provide universal access, particularly in education. That is the area that I would say Jamaica, and sorry, not just Jamaica, but all countries have probably suffered the most in, which is that you have a huge digital divide in education. You have kids like mine who, he has a computer, he has unlimited internet access, but then you go to other schools where probably 20% of the kids can get online. And so many of them have missed an entire year of education because they either don't have a device or they don't have unlimited internet to stay on a Zoom call for 6 hours a day doing class, right? So there has to be an imperative on the part of government to ensure for those who are in need that we can provide access by ensuring that you have in communities free Wi-Fi hotspots, so that persons can go to a community center, they can bring their tablet or their phone and they can log on and they can be able to access school, as an example. But it also presents a big opportunity, because what the pandemic has shown is that you can stay in one country and effectively work with people in another, because people have been working remotely for the last 12 to 15 months in ways that hitherto were unknown. You know, people felt if you had a business meeting, you had to jump on a plane and go and meet somebody to do a deal. People are doing it online. So it also opens up opportunities, I believe, for Jamaicans to participate in the broader global environment and to take advantage of work opportunities. But again, you have to ensure that access to the internet is at a competitive price, that everybody, not everybody, but those who want it can afford it. And unfortunately, the distribution is still heavily in the urban centers, and many of the rural areas are still way behind in terms of connectivity and the speed of connectivity. And so there has to be some kind of balance, which I think government has the principal role to play in ensuring that those who are least served can have access. And so that's really what I think, you know, universal service funds, which most governments in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, have to be deployed to bridge that gap.
So I'm not an engineer, so I think, but when we look at the infrastructure, and as you said, I think the challenge here is to get access to everybody, or let's say 95% of the population to get to get internet access to these to the people. But when we look at the Caribbean, it's just a big challenge with a lot of islands and just a technical challenge. So do you think that the private sector, the government, or maybe a company like Starlink from Elon Musk that just rolls out global internet on a global scale will be a solution, or a mixture out of that? Or what would be your, you were looking forward, how we can ensure that over, I don't know, the last 5 or whatever time frame we want to look at, 5 years, whatever, we can ensure that basically everybody in the Caribbean has access to a high-speed internet connection and can participate, as you said, from the global economy, and actually has access to the opportunities that you have with the global economy.
Well, I don't expect governments to undertake that kind of investment. But what governments have to do is create the regulatory environment and the policy environment to encourage private investment. You know, in Jamaica, about 20 years ago, we liberalized our telecom sector, which ended the monopoly that cable and wireless had, and it brought in new entrants into the market. We now have 2 main players. The government has issued a license for a 3rd player, and I understand that a license for a 4th player is going to be issued very soon. That is what I believe government has to do. You have to ensure that your spectrum pricing is attractive enough that investors will want to invest in purchasing spectrum so they can offer these services, and that you maintain a competitive environment. You know, we have 2 dominant players now. I believe there is room in the market for competition because, as I said, there are still underserved areas, and there are many people who are unhappy with the quality of the current service that's being provided, right?
Yeah, true.
Drop calls, you know, personally, I've had to complain to the provider at my house that, you know, I'm on a Zoom call and it drops 2 or 3 times, you know? So for me, government's role here is not to fund it themselves. Government can fund like free Wi-Fi hotspots in what I would call depressed communities. But what government has to do here is create an environment which allows the private sector to invest to make a return. And we've seen some signs of it, but I think it needs to happen in a more aggressive way right now.
How would you do that? How would you incentivize investors, foreign countries? Because I think, as you said, there is a kind of barrier to entry to the market in Jamaica, because, as you said, we basically have 2 operators there that share the market, I think almost even geographically. So what would you tell a company from outside to say, hey, invest in Jamaica for?
Absolutely, I would. Because equally, you could say 20 years ago when we liberalized the market, there was a monopoly. And at the time, people would have said, well, people are not going to leave cable and wireless and go to somebody else. Well, they did. And that led to the formation of Digicel, first in Jamaica, then the rest of the Caribbean and all over the world. Yes, the market may seem impregnable, but I don't think it is, because 1, the cost of high-speed internet is still relatively expensive. And as I said, there are so many complaints that people have about the quality of the service. So you have to look at what spectrum do you have that is available, how are you going to price it, so that it obviously has to be internationally competitively priced, because an investor has options between Jamaica and other countries in the Caribbean and anywhere in the world. And any investor wants to make a return on his or her investment. So you have to price it attractively, and then you have to go out internationally and, you know, put out an RFP for anybody who wants to participate. So to me, you have to be very proactive about it. And government can't rest and say, okay, we have two players who control the market and that's good enough. I believe a player that offers attractively priced data, and it's obviously going to be a data player. Everything has moved from voice to data, and voice is now predominantly being used over data, right?
True.
But so you have a segment of the market that I believe would move for good quality at better prices. And I think the experience we saw 20 years ago when digital came into the market, that shook up the mobile market. Again, I believe the data market needs a shaking up right now.
So what would you say would be a competitive price in Jamaica from you as a consumer standpoint? Because I think, again, I think the solution that Elon Musk is going to offer is something like you buy the basic starter kit, meaning the hardware, which is a satellite thing, and then you pay, I think, $100 per month for a high-speed internet connection, which from my point of view is kind of on the higher end of the pricing when we look at the Caribbean market. But what would be your range or your dream situation?
That would be on the higher end of the market. But again, you know, it depends on what speed and what you're going to be guaranteed in terms of quality. Yeah, I mean, I think for us in Jamaica, you'd have to price it lower than that. But frankly, you know, it depends on the market you're targeting. Businesses pay a lot more than that for internet services at businesses. Homes, that would be on the higher end of a home, but I would pay it if I'm guaranteed a certain speed. I mean, I'm paying now for 100 megabits. I don't know if I get 100 megabits, but you know, if I can be guaranteed that I'm not going to be knocked off my Zoom calls, and if when my wife has a meeting and if my son is doing his school, we can all coexist and we all have high quality internet, yeah, I would pay for it, because frankly, this mode, even if we get over COVID, there's still going to be an element of using the technology to operate on a daily basis. But I think you'd have to come in at a lower price point in Jamaica if you want to pull people away from the two main competitors.
True. So what would be or do we have a time frame or a time horizon where you say, okay, in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, Jamaica has to do something about that?
Well, in fairness, I mean, something has started. The government announced a couple of weeks ago that they have issued a third license, and my information, although this is not confirmed in the public domain, I understand there's a fourth player to also enter the market. So, you know, strides are being made, and in a positive way in that regard. So I think, you know, when a new entrant comes in, the person has to invest a lot in infrastructure or have some infrastructure sharing arrangement with the existing ones. So I don't know if you're going to see, you know, an offer on the table right now, you know, because it takes probably, I don't know, maybe a year to build out until you can start to offer, unless you're going to share infrastructure. So I think strides are being made, and I think it just has to be pursued in a more aggressive way.
Yeah, definitely agree. So besides the infrastructure, and I think, we both agree here that progress is being made. It would be appreciated by everybody if it would be a little faster, I think. But besides that, how important is education, but not just general education, but more in a way of like, call it digital skills, or having the knowledge actually to be competitive in that environment. I know that you have work with the Startup Jamaica as an incubator. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, what you're doing there, but what is your point of view, what needs to be done in the Caribbean in general, but in Jamaica, to make sure that the generation that we have right now and the next generations have the skill set that they need to be actually, because on the one hand, I think what you're absolutely right about is that it gives you a lot of options now for everybody. But on the other hand, it also gives a lot of competition, because now you compete also with everybody.
With everybody else. Correct.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I've been pretty consistent on the need for a national digital literacy program in the very same way that when you start in school, you're learned the basic things about mathematics or English. I believe that has to be introduced from the level of schools, because the reality is that the world that my son is growing up in is totally different from the one that I grew up in. And frankly, you know, because he has been on Zoom for the last year, his exposure is very high, and he probably knows more. He has had more Zoom time than me, right? Because on average, he's spending 6 hours a day on Zoom. So he knows how to do everything on Zoom. So almost by default, he has had that exposure. And he can navigate at 6 around the computer in a way that, I mean, I didn't until probably I was in my 20s, but it was just a different generation. But what I think we have to do is ensure that everybody has that exposure, and that, you know, the generation coming up understands how to use the technology in a way which is not just about social media, which everybody's on, but it is, what can I do that allows me to make money, to offer a good or a service online, not just in Jamaica or the Caribbean, but globally, which really was the thinking behind Startup Jamaica. And Startup Jamaica is no longer operational. We started it when we were in government in 2015, I believe, 2014, 2015. And it really was meant as an incubator for tech entrepreneurs. You know, Jamaica, I would regard as one of the most entrepreneurial people. And we had a lot of young entrepreneurs, but they didn't have a support ecosystem. They didn't know where to go to get funding. They didn't have a physical space that they could operate out of, where they could sit down and share ideas. So Startup Jamaica provided that. It was part of an ecosystem. It was a physical space. We provided mentorship, guidance, support, linked entrepreneurs to investors. Unfortunately, when the government changed, the new government had different ideas about how it wanted to approach it. So they discontinued the program, which I felt was very unfortunate. And so we don't have any type of program like that. And I believe it is still very much needed, and even more so in the environment that we're in now. So really, for me, what I want Jamaica to evolve to is not just being consumers of technology. You know, we have the latest gadgets, we have the devices, but we want to build solutions to problems which exist. We want to be the developers that are creating applications that can be used across the world, and so that we can become the producers and earn foreign exchange from these services. That's really the vision we had with Startup Jamaica, and it's still a very relevant vision given where Jamaica is right now.
Absolutely agree. And my question would then be, or I would also, when I say agree, I mean, I agree that there needs to be the ecosystem or the support or the infrastructure for, yeah, let's say startups or entrepreneurs or tech companies in general to be able to grow, because most of these companies, especially at the beginning, require a lot of capital to actually get pulled off and be competitive in the marketplace. And when we look at the US, where we have big VC companies that put millions and then sometimes billions in these companies, or when we look at China, same there. Europe, not so much yet, but I think Europe is also catching up a little bit. So the question often comes down to money, to be frankly, to how attractive again is it to maybe outside investors. And I think the Caribbean, or maybe Jamaica too, has maybe not the best reputation for international investors, because it's literally a term like having offshore bank accounts or something when you have something shady going on. So how do you make it attractive and safe on the other hand, or transparent, or however you want to call it, for investors, or maybe not investors, maybe I'm looking to narrow out the problem here, but to create an ecosystem that can support companies, startups, entrepreneurs in Jamaica or in the Caribbean to be able to build something in that field, because you need the skills. And I'm absolutely with you there that I think every country needs a, as you said, digital literacy program. But how do you also make sure that the support, the financial support in that case, is available for the companies or the individuals?
Well, what I would say, I think there are barriers to more investment in this area. I would say one of the biggest ones is any investor who is looking to invest has to determine how does he exit. And, in the US, you exit through the stock market.
Right.
In the Caribbean, our stock markets, I would say, are outside the reach of a typical small entrepreneur. Meaning when you look at the companies that we have two markets, we have a junior and we have a main. But the companies that are on the stock market tend to be well-established companies versus an entrepreneur who starts a small business. So one deterrent is the issue of how do I get back my money through an exit? Although, frankly, one investor can buy out another, and those deals can be done privately.
True, yeah.
The second issue is obviously how do I ensure I scale this business? So, the Jamaican and the Caribbean market is small in relative terms. If you take the English-speaking Caribbean, you're talking about 10 million people. If you include Cuba and Haiti, then it's a bit more, but it's not English-speaking, right? So in relative terms, you have to be thinking of a solution which is applicable outside of the region. So I'm not going, me being a VC investor in San Fran, Silicon Valley, I'm not going to invest in a Jamaican startup that is only looking at the Caribbean.
Right.
Because I can't make a return on my investment, right?
It's too small.
So it's just too small. So you have to figure out what is it that I'm going to build, which is attractive enough that someone who's making the investment can see a return. So it requires a vision beyond the local geographic area, and ensuring that whatever the problem you're trying to solve, which may exist in the Caribbean, may also exist somewhere else. It may not be the US, but it may be somewhere else in the world, which gives you access to a larger market. So I think that is the second thing. Mm-hmm. The third is obviously we're becoming more mature in terms of doing these types of arrangements, but we're still at the early stages. The idea of people investing in companies is something which has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years. So it's not we're not a mature market from the perspective of, people are used to, putting 100,000 US in a company, that kind of thing. It's still growing. And, it requires mentorship, it requires support, it requires, saying to an investor, you have to formalize your business, you have to register it. You may have to register it in the US if you want to be attractive to US investors. As an example, you have to ensure that you have proper accounts, if you want external investors, because they want to ensure that the money is being managed properly. Right. So all of these things are relatively new things to groups of entrepreneurs who may be very talented in terms of their knowledge of the solution they're building, but they're not necessarily business persons. So it's also about how do you ensure that the board of directors has the right mix of skills and expertise so that someone can succeed in a global environment.
So what would you recommend to a Caribbean or Jamaican organization or company? What would be a market or a focus, or generally speaking, a trend somebody should focus on to be ensured, as you said, to reach that scalability?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I would say is that whatever solution you're developing, it has to go beyond just the confines of a local market, because I don't think the local market is large enough to sustain it. So identify a problem, determine where else that problem exists. It might be in the rest of the Caribbean. And you can, so for example, you have a guy, Gordon Swaby, who built a company called Edifocal, which allows students to do their CSEC and CAPE exams online. So he started it, it was Jamaican, but it's applicable in the English-speaking Caribbean because we all do the same common exams under the CXC umbrella. That's an example of something that can be scaled. It can probably be used in other countries that use the same types of exams for students. So you have to figure out which spot in the market is attractive enough for you to build and grow the business beyond the shores of Jamaica. And obviously, I think, you know, as an investor, you have to determine, you need to know what your own strengths are. If you are the person who is the developer, you may not have the business and the marketing skills. So you have to then say, all right, you know, do I form a partnership with somebody who can bring this to the table? Do I give up some equity in the company to someone who will allow me to grow and scale? These are all things which, through mentorship and guidance, I believe entrepreneurs can get to the stage where they can negotiate these things and build their businesses and grow.
Is there any kind of hub or starting point or network that you would recommend or that you can recommend to companies in Jamaica or in the Caribbean that focuses on that?
There are some informal networks. You have a group of angel investors, First Angels, led by Sandra Glasgow, who was the original manager at the Startup Jamaica program. And they really, it's a, you know, a group of high net worth individuals who look at startups and make a decision as to whether they invest in it. And they have built a community that provides support. Many of the investors are business leaders themselves, so they end up sitting on boards, mentoring some of these young entrepreneurs, as an example. The reality is that you need more of that. I mean, Sandra has done a good job of curating that and growing that, but you would need a couple more. One started in Montego Bay, along Alpha Investors, I think the name is. But you're going to need, and you also need, to me, some support system. It doesn't have to be necessarily government funded, but I still believe the idea of an incubator where you share space, where people can bounce ideas off each other, is a good one to nourish the ideas, share the ideas, and allow them to flourish and grow. And so, you know, it doesn't have to be, as I said, government funded, but there's still a need for it.
Yeah, true. Before we wrap this up, what would be, or what is in your eyes a market or an industry or a trend that you see when it comes to technology or digital transformation in the Caribbean for the next years?
I mean, COVID has just disrupted everything. So, I mean, the idea, for example, you know, the government has launched a program called ENDS, which is, it allows food service delivery companies to grow. And now there's a whole business around food delivery, which never existed before, you know, where all of these food companies are having deliveries. That's one aspect of something that will continue. I believe education, and the people will choose more online options going forward than necessarily physical education at the tertiary level. Meaning, you know, if I can go online and do a number of courses or do a degree in a shorter period of time, much less expensive, it is something that I would consider. So I think education, and then financial services. I think, you know, we have to, one of the issues we have in Jamaica is that so many Jamaicans are unbanked. They have no formal banking relationship. And again, it tends to be divided by, you know, persons in the lower socioeconomic groupings are the ones who are mostly unbanked. So there are still opportunities to bring those people into a network which gives them immediate access to cash electronically, and opportunities for them to build businesses too. So, you know, for me, I think the big opportunity, which is the challenge, lies in how do you deal with that digital divide? Because in Jamaica, there are as many people who are not connected as there are who are connected. And that represents an opportunity for a bigger market. But there are barriers, and the barriers are that grouping doesn't have the disposable income to, have the computers, the tablets, etc., to have $100 a month subscription or whatever the figure is, whether it's 50 or 25. So how do you bring them to the table? And that to me is a big opportunity, and an opportunity that provides it provides a way for a company to make money, So those are things that I think represent opportunities going forward for businesses.
Do you know if there's any initiative or plans or incentive from the Jamaican government in that direction, meaning payment solutions, banking accounts, maybe with blockchain technology or something like that?
The Bank of Jamaica has signaled that it's going to introduce digital currency, and they have started the process of identifying a provider for that. The government is also providing loans and grants to small businesses to digitize their businesses. And, we overuse the term, but by that, my interpretation is, how do you ensure that your processes are adapted in a way that you can function in an online world? So there are things that are being done. Obviously, more has to be done and more done quickly, but I would say there are signs of stuff that has started.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So first of all, thanks for your time. But is there anything else that you want to add that you have to say?
I think one of the big risks as well relates to cybersecurity. And as you move more things online, the cyber criminals see it as more of an opportunity. And we've seen globally some of the ransomware attacks that have taken place recently. And, the challenge is, I think, the very smart IT professionals, somewhere are going to be attracted to that side of the criminal business because people see it as an opportunity to make money because more and more people are going to be online. So it's just a caution. You can't get away from it. In the same way you drive on the road, you have to be careful. Once you're online, you have to be careful. And the risks are going to be greater, but the opportunities are there. So it's just a caution that both businesses and individuals have to be conscious of what the risks are, do the basic things in terms of how you protect your identity, particularly financial transactions, ensuring that sites you do business with are certified and are reliable and have a track record, etc. So those are things that I think people just have to be aware of as they navigate this space.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Julian Robinson. I appreciate it and hope to see you next time.